Time was money, and money was time. That's what Thaddeus "Thad" Sterling had always believed until the call came at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. But before his world imploded, before he learned that success could feel like bankruptcy, he stood on the 64th floor of Sterling Innovations, watching San Francisco's morning fog roll beneath him like a sea of secrets. Inside his corner office, his reflection ghosted against the gray skyline, a 38-year-old emperor of silicon and circuitry who had everything money could buy, except the things that mattered, and he had long ago convinced himself he didn't need them. "Your mother called again," Vivian Pierce said from the doorway, her heels clicking against Italian marble as she approached his desk. "She wanted me to remind you about dinner tonight. It's her 65th birthday, Thad." Thad's fingers danced across his smartphone screen, his eyes never leaving the quarterly projections displayed on his tablet. "Send her the usual arrangement from Winston's Florals. Double the orchids this time." He paused, finally glancing up at Vivian, who had been his executive assistant for the past decade. "And have the jet ready tomorrow morning. The Singapore deal can't wait." Vivian's face softened with familiar disappointment. She had watched Thad build his empire from a garage startup to a $50 billion tech giant, but she had also witnessed the cost. The burning ambition that had lifted him from the scholarship student to billionaire had also burned every bridge he'd ever built. "She doesn't want flowers, Thad. She wants her son." The words hung in the air like smoke, but Thad had mastered the art of suffocation long ago. He straightened his bespoke suit jacket, another armor in his collection, and moved toward the conference room where 12 board members awaited his presence. "The Tokyo market opens in an hour. We need to finalize the Asian expansion before—" His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Thad typically ignored these, but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the way the morning light caught the screen, or maybe it was the weight of Vivian's words still pressing against his chest. "Thaddeus Sterling speaking." The voice on the other end was clinical, professional. "Mr. Sterling, this is Dr. Evelyn Blackwood from Metro General Hospital. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." There was a pause, the kind that preceded life-changing moments. "We have a 6-year-old patient named Aurora. She was brought in this morning, and, sir, your name is listed on her birth certificate as her father." The world tilted. Thad's fingers tightened around his phone as memories he'd buried beneath spreadsheets and stock options clawed their way to the surface. Scarlett, the artist who had painted colors into his monochrome world 6 years ago, only to disappear without a trace. Scarlett, who had tried to teach him that life wasn't measured in fiscal quarters, but in moments. "There must be some mistake," Thad heard himself say. But even as the words left his mouth, he was calculating dates, remembering their last night together, her tears, his promises, the way she had touched his face as if memorizing it. "Sir," Dr. Blackwood continued, her voice cutting through his thoughts, "the child is in serious condition. We need you to come in as soon as possible." Behind him, the board members were visible through the glass walls, their impatience evident in their shifting seats and checking watches. The Singapore deal would make headlines. The Asian expansion would add billions to the company's value. But for the first time in 20 years, Thaddeus Sterling, the man who had programmed his life to maximize every second, found himself frozen between heartbeats, between breaths, between the empire he had built and the life he never knew existed. Vivian watched as something cracked in her boss's carefully constructed facade. His hand trembled as he lowered the phone, and when he turned to her, she saw something she had never witnessed in all their years together. Fear. "Cancel everything," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Cancel it all." The drive to Metro General felt like crossing an ocean of memories. Thad's Aston Martin sliced through the fog-laden streets of San Francisco, each red light a crimson reminder of time's sudden weight. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, mind racing faster than the engine beneath him. Scarlett. Her name had been locked away in a vault of regrets he never allowed himself to open. Now it spilled out, flooding his thoughts with images of paint-stained fingers and midnight discussions about dreams that had nothing to do with market shares. She had been his opposite in every way. Her studio apartment filled with canvases and possibility, her laughter unrehearsed and free. While he measured success in digits, she measured it in brushstrokes. His phone buzzed incessantly. The board members were probably in chaos. A notification flashed. The Singapore deal was wavering. Another, his stocks had dropped 2 points on rumors of his sudden departure. 6 years ago, these alerts would have sent him racing back to his office. Now they felt like echoes from another life. At a stoplight, he found himself opening his banking app, scrolling through years of transaction history. There they were, the monthly checks he'd sent Scarlett after their split, each one a paper barrier between his conscience and his choices. Every single one, uncashed. "Why?" he whispered to the empty car. "Why didn't you tell me?" His phone rang again. "Vivian." He switched to speaker. "I'm almost there. Thad, there's something you need to know." Her voice carried the weight of withheld information. "I did some quick research. Scarlett, she passed away 3 weeks ago. Car accident on Highway 1. Aurora's been living with Scarlett's sister, Catherine." The Aston Martin swerved slightly. A horn blared. The fog seemed to thicken, or maybe it was just his vision blurring. "The board is threatening an emergency meeting," Vivian continued, her tone shifting to business. "Harrison Wade is rallying votes. They're calling it a crisis of leadership." Thad nearly laughed. A crisis of leadership. As if the real crisis wasn't the 6 years of birthdays he'd missed, the first steps he hadn't seen, the bedtime stories he'd never read. 6 years of a life he should have known about, should have been part of, compressed into a single phone call and a hospital waiting room. "Let them meet," he said, pulling into the hospital parking structure. "Let them vote. Let them—" His voice caught as he passed the pediatric wing sign. "Vivian, she's 6 years old. 6 years, and I never knew. What kind of man does that make me?" The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats. "The kind who has a chance to make it right," Vivian finally answered. "I'll hold them off as long as I can. Go meet your daughter." Daughter. The word hit him like a physical force. He killed the engine, sat in the sudden quiet of the concrete structure. Through his windshield, the hospital loomed, a stark white monolith housing a truth he wasn't prepared for, but could no longer avoid. His phone buzzed one final time. A news alert. Sterling Innovations stock plummets amid CEO's mysterious departure. 6 years ago, this would have been his nightmare. Now, as he stepped out of his car and walked toward the hospital entrance, it felt like waking up. The pediatric wing of Metro General was a contradiction in colors, cheerful murals battling with stark medical equipment, the sound of children's laughter mixing with the steady beep of monitors. Thad's Italian leather shoes squeaked against the freshly waxed floor as he followed Dr. Blackwood down a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. Aurora was brought in early this morning with severe respiratory distress, Dr. Blackwood explained, her white coat swishing as she walked. "We've stabilized her condition, but—" She paused, turning to face him. "Mr. Sterling, your daughter has a rare genetic condition, one that requires specialized treatment that most insurance companies won't cover." The irony wasn't lost on him. A billionaire's child struggling for treatment she couldn't access. Before he could respond, a woman's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Well, if it isn't the great Thaddeus Sterling, finally gracing us with his presence." He turned to find a younger version of Scarlett standing there, same auburn hair, same fierce green eyes. But where Scarlett's face had always held warmth, this woman's features were carved in ice. Catherine, Scarlett's sister, the woman who had been more of a parent to his daughter than he had ever been. "Catherine, Save it," she interrupted, arms crossed. 6 years of silence, and now you show up in your $1,000 suit, probably thinking you can throw money at this like you do everything else. Her voice cracked slightly. "Do you know what her favorite color is? Her biggest fear? Do you know she refuses to go to sleep without hearing 'Good Night Moon' first, just like Scarlett did when we were kids? Each question was a dagger, precise and deserved. But before Thad could respond, a small voice drifted from the room behind Catherine. "Aunt Katie, who are you talking to?" The world seemed to freeze. Catherine's expression shifted, softening instantly as she turned toward the voice. Someone who knew your mommy, sweetheart." Thad stepped around Catherine, and for the first time he saw her. Aurora. She sat propped up in a hospital bed that seemed too big for her small frame, an oxygen tube beneath her nose, and a sketchbook balanced on her lap. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were his mother's eyes, the same amber-flecked brown that had watched him grow up. She was drawing something, a garden of impossible flowers in colors that shouldn't work together but somehow did. Just like her mother, just like Scarlet. "Your flowers are purple and orange," he heard himself say, his voice barely a whisper. "Most people wouldn't think to put those together." Aurora's face lit up. Mommy always said the best art breaks the rules. She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that felt familiar. He saw it every morning in the mirror. "Did you really know her?" Before he could answer, a coughing fit seized her. Catherine rushed forward, but Dr. Blackwood was already there, adjusting monitors and checking vitals. Thad stood frozen, watching his daughter struggle for breath, the weight of 6 years of absence crushing his chest. When the coughing subsided, Aurora slumped back against her pillows, exhausted but still clutching her sketchbook. Her small fingers traced the outline of a half-finished flower, and without looking up, she asked, "Are you my dad?" The question hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful, fragile, and impossible to ignore. In that moment, surrounded by beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic, Thad Sterling, the man who always had an answer, who could close billion-dollar deals with a single word, found himself speechless in front of the only person whose opinion suddenly mattered more than any board members ever had. "Yes," Thad answered, the word barely audible over the steady rhythm of medical equipment. "I'm your father." The truth felt both monumental and inadequate, like trying to describe an ocean as just water. Aurora's response was interrupted by Dr. Blackwood clearing her throat. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Matthews, we need to discuss Aurora's treatment plan." Her expression carried the weight of news no one wanted to hear. "The genetic condition affecting Aurora's respiratory system is progressive. There's an experimental treatment available at Johns Hopkins, but—" "Cost isn't an issue," Thad interjected, already reaching for his phone. Catherine's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "Of course that's your answer. Throw money at it. But you can't buy back 6 years, Sterling. You can't purchase her trust or her love, or stop it." Aurora's voice, though weakened by her condition, carried authority that silenced them both. "You're fighting like Tommy and Lisa in my class, and Miss Wilson always says—" Another coughing fit seized her, this one worse than the last. As machines beeped in alarm, Thad found himself being ushered out of the room with Catherine, watching through the window as Dr. Blackwood and 2 nurses worked to stabilize his daughter. His daughter. The word still felt foreign on his tongue, like a language he was just learning to speak. His phone vibrated, Vivian's name flashing on the screen. He stepped away from the window to answer it, Catherine's glare following him like a shadow. "The vultures are circling," Vivian reported without preamble. "Harrison Wade called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He's claiming your personal crisis demonstrates instability. There's more. Someone leaked photos of you entering the hospital. Social media is exploding with speculation." Through the hospital window, he could see Aurora's small form surrounded by medical staff. She clutched her sketchbook like a lifeline, and suddenly he remembered finding Scarlet the same way years ago, holding on to her art during their worst fights. "Mr. Sterling?" A new voice interrupted his thoughts. A man in an expensive suit that screamed "lawyer" stood before him, flanked by 2 others. "I'm James Morrison from Child Protective Services. We need to discuss custody arrangements." The word custody hit Catherine like a physical blow. "You can't be serious," she snarled. "You abandoned her for 6 years, and now you think—" Miss Matthews, Morrison cut in smoothly. Given Mr. Sterling's resources and Aurora's medical needs, we need to consider all options for her best interests. As they argued, Thad's attention was drawn back to the hospital room. Aurora had begun drawing again, her movements precise despite her obvious exhaustion. Even from this distance, he could see she held her pencil the same way he did when sketching prototype designs, the same grip his father had taught him before spreadsheets replaced blueprints in his life. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from an unknown number. "Your father's old partner sends regards. Shame about 98. Wonder what the board would think about the real story behind the Sterling Innovations startup funds." The past was catching up, threading itself through the present like poison. His father's death, the questionable source of his initial funding, the burned bridges and buried secrets, all of it surfacing now, just when he'd found something worth more than his empire. In the hospital room, Aurora's monitors had stabilized. She looked up, caught him watching, and did something that shattered every wall he'd built around his heart over the past 20 years. She smiled. It was Scarlett's smile, bright and unguarded, full of a hope he'd forgotten how to feel. The lawyer was still talking about custody rights. His phone was still buzzing with crisis alerts. Somewhere in a boardroom, vultures were circling his life's work. But for the first time since he'd walked into that garage with nothing but dreams and determination, Thaddeus Sterling realized he'd been measuring success in all the wrong ways. The hospital cafeteria at midnight was a liminal space, suspended between urgency and exhaustion. Thad sat alone at a corner table, his untouched coffee growing cold, while his phone displayed an email he'd read a dozen times. It was from Scarlett, dated 6 years ago, never sent, discovered in her personal effects by Catherine. "I wanted to tell you," the email read, "every day for 9 months I picked up the phone. But you were always in meetings, always closing deals, always chasing the next billion. The day Aurora was born, they placed her in my arms, and she had your mother's eyes. I knew then that telling you would mean watching her inherit your absence, just like you inherited your father's." His hands trembled as he scrolled further. Memories of his own childhood surfaced. Empty chairs at school plays, missed dinners, a father who built an empire but forgot to build a home. History wasn't just repeating, it was mocking him. Mr. Sterling? He looked up to find Dr. Blackwood, her white coat traded for casual clothes, looking as exhausted as he felt. She sat down without waiting for an invitation. "The treatment at Johns Hopkins," she began, sliding a tablet across the table. "It's not just experimental, it's controversial. The success rate is promising, but the recovery process is intense. Aurora would need a full-time caregiver for at least 6 months." The unspoken question hung between them. Would the man who couldn't spare an hour for dinner with his mother commit half a year to a sick child? His phone lit up with another message from the anonymous threat-maker. "The truth about 98 comes out tomorrow at 9 a.m. unless you transfer a controlling interest in Sterling Innovations. Your father knew when to fold. Do you?" 1998. The year everything changed. The year his father died, leaving behind a legacy built on quicksand. The year Thad had made choices that haunted him still. "She asks about you," Dr. Blackwood said softly, pulling him back to the present. "Between treatments. She wants to know if you like purple and orange too, if you can draw, if you'll still be here tomorrow." Before he could respond, Catherine appeared in the cafeteria doorway, her face pale. "Aurora's asking for you," she said, the words seeming to cost her. "She had a nightmare. She wants her father." The word father echoed in his mind as he followed Catherine back to the pediatric wing. In Aurora's room, monitors cast a blue glow over her small form. She clutched a worn copy of Goodnight Moon, her eyes bright with fever. "The flowers were chasing me," she whispered as he approached. "In my dream. They were all wrong, just black and white, like old photographs. Mommy always said art needs color to be alive." She looked up at him, wisdom beyond her years in those familiar eyes. "Is that why you stopped drawing? Did your colors go away too?" The question struck him like lightning. How did she know? Then he remembered the engineering sketches in his father's old office, the half-finished designs he'd abandoned for spreadsheets and stock options, the passion he'd traded for profit. His phone buzzed again. Harrison Wade's name this time. The board meeting was moved up to 7 a.m. In 5 hours, he could lose everything he'd spent 20 years building. His empire, his reputation, his legacy. But sitting there, watching Aurora trace the book's worn pages with fingers that shook slightly from medication, Thad Sterling realized that legacy wasn't something you built in boardrooms. It lived in purple and orange flowers, in bedtime stories, in the courage to choose differently than your father did. "Want to hear a secret?" he said softly, pulling his chair closer to her bed. "I used to love drawing too. And tomorrow, I'll show you how to make the flowers in your dreams come alive with every color we can find." It was a promise that would cost him everything, and for the first time in his adult life, that felt exactly right. Dawn crept into Aurora's hospital room like a timid guest. Thad hadn't left her bedside since the nightmare, watching her chest rise and fall with each assisted breath, memorizing the way her hair curled against the pillow just like Scarlett's had. His laptop glowed softly in his lap. The board meeting would begin via video call in 30 minutes. "You should eat something," Vivian said, appearing at his side like a guardian angel with coffee and a breakfast sandwich. She'd arrived an hour ago with his suit, ready to help him fight whatever battles lay ahead. "The vultures are circling. Harrison Wade has proxy votes from 3 board members already." Thad's fingers traced the edge of his laptop, where a single email waited to be sent. It contained his resignation as CEO, the truth about 1998, and everything he'd buried to build his empire. One click, and it would all crumble. The company, the reputation, the carefully constructed facade of success. "She draws the way I used to," he said quietly, nodding toward Aurora's sketchbook. "Look at the attention to detail, the way she plans each stroke. She's not just creating, she's engineering beauty, just like—" He swallowed hard. "Just like I did, before I let my father convince me that art was a hobby and empire building was a legacy." The monitor beside Aurora's bed beeped, a gentle reminder of what was really at stake. Dr. Blackwood had left the Johns Hopkins treatment protocols up on his tablet. 6 months of intensive care, experimental procedures, and a recovery process that would require constant attention. The kind of attention he'd never given anything except profit margins. His phone buzzed. A text from the anonymous blackmailer. "Time's up. Last chance to save your empire. Board meeting starts in 20 minutes. But it was the second message that made his heart stop. An alert from Aurora's monitors to the nurse's station. Her oxygen levels were dropping again. As if sensing his concern, she stirred in her sleep, her small hand reaching out unconsciously. Without thinking, he took it, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his. "Mr. Sterling?" Catherine stood in the doorway, looking like she hadn't slept either. "I found these in Scarlett's studio." She held out a stack of envelopes, all addressed to him, none sent. "She wrote to you every year on Aurora's birthday. I thought you should have them before you make your decision." The top envelope was marked, "First Birthday." With trembling fingers he opened it. "Dear Thad, today our daughter took her first steps. She fell 7 times and got up 8. She has your determination, your spirit. I see you in every stubborn lift of her chin, every problem she refuses to let beat her. I wish you could see it too." The laptop chimed. The board meeting would begin in 5 minutes. Harrison Wade's face appeared in the waiting room along with 11 other board members. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again, probably the blackmailer's final warning. "Sir," Vivian said softly, "they're waiting." Thad looked at Aurora, peacefully sleeping despite the machines helping her breathe. Then at the letters in his lap, 6 years of moments he'd never get back. Finally, at his laptop, where his entire board waited to either support him or destroy him, he thought of his father who had died clutching a phone instead of his son's hand. Of Scarlett, who had faced every doctor's appointment and school play alone. Of all the choices that had led him here, to this moment where the word legacy finally meant something real. "Vivian," he said, his voice steady for the first time in 24 hours, "please tell the board I have an announcement to make. And then I need you to call Johns Hopkins. Tell them we're coming. Tell them to be ready." He looked down at his sleeping daughter, squeezed her hand gently, and prepared to sacrifice an empire to save something far more precious, a future worth more than all the stock options in a world. The morning headlines screamed across every major financial news outlet. Sterling Innovations in freefall. CEO admits to historical fraud. Tech giant crumbles as founder steps down. Sterling's secret child, the $50 billion love child scandal. Each notification felt like an obituary for his old life, but Thad hadn't looked at his phone since the board meeting. His attention was focused entirely on Aurora, who was watching him with curious eyes as he unpacked a set of professional drawing pencils. "Mom had ones like these," she said, running her fingers over the metallic case. "She said they were magic wands for making dreams come real." A cough interrupted her words, gentler than before, thanks to the new medication protocol Dr. Blackwood had started. "She was right," Thad replied, selecting a pencil. "Your mother always understood the magic in things that most people missed, like putting purple and orange together." He began sketching on a fresh page of Aurora's sketchbook, his strokes hesitant at first, then growing more confident. "Did she ever tell you about the time she painted the entire ceiling of her studio to look like a galaxy?" Aurora's eyes widened. "That was Mom? I thought it had always been there." 3 days on a ladder with glow-in-the-dark paint, he smiled, the memory both sweet and painful. She said every artist needed their own sky to dream under. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Vivian's arrival. Her usual polished appearance was slightly disheveled, evidence of the chaos she'd been managing. "The Johns Hopkins team is ready. The medical transport will be here in an hour." She paused, her professional mask slipping. "Harrison Wade is giving interviews. He's not being kind." "Let him talk," Thad said, continuing his sketch. Aurora leaned forward, watching as the lines began to form a familiar shape, the Sterling Innovations building, but reimagined as a fantastic castle with impossible spires and floating gardens. The board voted unanimously to appoint Wade as interim CEO, Vivian continued. "And the SEC is Miss Pierce?" Aurora's small voice cut through the corporate catastrophe. "Would you like to learn to draw too? Daddy's teaching me about perspective." The word Daddy hung in the air, new and precious and completely unconcerned with stock prices or board votes. Vivian's professional demeanor cracked entirely, a smile breaking through. "I'd like that very much, sweetheart." Before she could join them, Catherine appeared in the doorway. Her face was a complex mix of emotions as she watched the scene before her. "The social worker is here," she said quietly, "about the temporary guardianship for the Hopkins treatment." The room's atmosphere tensed. Catherine had fought the arrangement initially, but Aurora's need for constant care during the treatment had forced a reluctant compromise. Shared temporary guardianship, a bridge neither of them had expected to build. "We should all go," Aurora announced with 6-year-old wisdom. "Aunt Katie knows all Mom's stories, and Daddy can draw, and Miss Pierce makes everything work right, like a family." Family. The word echoed in the room like a bell, cutting through the tension. Thad looked down at his sketch, where he'd unconsciously added a small figure in one of the floating gardens. A little girl surrounded by impossible flowers. His phone buzzed one final time. The news alert showed his company's stock had hit rock bottom. His entire empire, built over 20 years, had evaporated in less than 24 hours. But as he watched Aurora add her own lines to their shared drawing, her small hand still occasionally shaky, but her spirit unshakable, he understood what Scarlett had known all along. Some things were worth losing a world to find. "A family," he repeated softly, meeting Catherine's eyes over Aurora's head. "Maybe that's what all of us needed, to learn how to build." Johns Hopkins loomed before them like a fortress of hope and fear combined. The private medical transport had landed an hour ago, and now Aurora's new room on the pediatric floor was filling with the soft beeps of unfamiliar machines. Through the window, Baltimore's skyline painted a different picture than San Francisco's familiar fog-harder edges, deeper shadows, as if the city itself knew the weight of what lay ahead. "The first phase of treatment begins tomorrow morning," Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead specialist, explained while reviewing Aurora's charts. "The procedure targets the genetic mutation affecting her lung development, but the recovery—" She paused, making sure both Thad and Catherine were listening. "The recovery will be more challenging than the treatment itself." Aurora, seemingly untroubled by talk of genetic mutations and experimental procedures, was busy decorating her new room. She'd insisted on hanging the drawing she and Thad had created together. The fantastic castle with its impossible gardens now watched over her bed like a promise. "Will it hurt?" she asked suddenly, her voice small but steady. "Mom always said the truth doesn't hurt as much as pretending." The adults in the room exchanged glances, years of mutual distrust beginning to crack under the weight of shared concern. It was Catherine who answered, moving to sit on the edge of Aurora's bed. "Yes, sweetheart, it might hurt. But you won't be alone this time, not for a single second." Thad's phone lit up with a text from Vivian back in San Francisco. "SEC investigation formally announced. Harrison Wade giving another press conference. Your mother's trying to reach you." His mother. In the chaos of the past few days, he'd almost forgotten about her birthday dinner. Was it only 3 days ago? It felt like another lifetime. Before he could respond, Aurora's monitor began beeping erratically. "Her oxygen levels are dropping." Dr. Chen moved quickly to the bedside. "This is what I was worried about. The altitude change from the flight might have—" "Tell me a story," Aurora wheezed between increasingly labored breaths. "The one about the galaxy ceiling." Thad found himself moving without thinking, sitting on the other side of her bed. "Your mom didn't just paint stars," he began, taking her small hand in his. "She painted dreams. Every constellation told a story." As he spoke, he watched the monitors, willing the numbers to stabilize. Catherine joined in, her voice blending with his. She used that special paint that glowed in the dark. Took her 3 days. "On a ladder," Aurora whispered, her breathing beginning to ease. "With glow-in-the-dark paint." The numbers on the monitor slowly climbed back to safer levels. Dr. Chen made notes on her tablet, but Thad caught the look in her eyes. This wouldn't be the last scare, not by far. Later that night, after Aurora had finally drifted off to sleep, Thad stood at the window watching the unfamiliar city lights. His phone showed missed calls from his lawyers, from reporters, from board members choosing sides in the corporate war he'd walked away from. But the only call he returned was to his mother. "I saw the news," she said when she answered. "All of it. The company, Aurora, everything." "Mom, I'm on my way to Baltimore," she interrupted. "Your father built an empire, but he forgot to build a home. You're choosing differently." "And?" He heard her voice catch. "I've always wanted a granddaughter to teach origami to." A soft sound made him turn. Aurora was stirring, caught in what seemed to be another nightmare. But before either he or Catherine could move, she settled, her hand clutching the edge of their shared drawing. Even in sleep, she was teaching them all how to be stronger than their fears. "She has your eyes, Mom," he whispered into the phone, "and Scarlett's heart. And somehow she's stronger than both of us ever were." In the darkness of a strange city facing battles on every front, medical, legal, personal. Thad Sterling finally understood what real courage looked like. It looked like purple and orange flowers, like stories about painted galaxies, like a little girl who got up 8 times after falling 7. And maybe, just maybe, it looked like a broken family learning to breathe together, one scary night at a time. 3 months into Aurora's treatment, the Johns Hopkins Pediatric Ward had become their new normal. The walls of room 412 were now a gallery of artwork, Aurora's drawings mingling with Thad's sketches, telling the story of their journey in colors and lines. But it was the newest addition that drew everyone's attention, a ceiling mural of a galaxy painted by Catherine during Aurora's stronger days, with glow-in-the-dark stars that watched over them all. "The latest test results are unexpected," Dr. Chen said, her usual clinical detachment softening as she looked at the gathered family. Thad and Catherine sat on either side of Aurora's bed, while his mother, Eleanor, worked on an origami crane by the window, her 70th, one for each day of Aurora's treatment so far. "Unexpected good or unexpected bad?" Aurora asked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. The experimental treatment had taken its toll, hair loss, weight loss, days of pain that no child should have to endure. But her spirit remained unbroken. Dr. Chen allowed herself a small smile. "The gene therapy is working better than we anticipated. Your body is not just accepting the treatment, it's adapting to it. In all my years of research, I've never seen—" The rest of her words faded into a blur of joyful tears and careful hugs. But their celebration was interrupted by a knock at the door. Vivian stood there, her expression urgent. "Thad, you need to see this." On her tablet, a video played. Harrison Wade, now CEO of Sterling Innovations, was holding a press conference. But instead of triumph, his face showed defeat. "In light of recent evidence, I must announce my immediate resignation. The allegations against Thaddeus Sterling regarding the events of 1998 were fabricated by me in an attempt to seize control of the company." The room fell silent. Aurora's small voice broke through. "Does this mean Daddy gets his castle back?" Thad looked at the empire he'd lost and then at the family he'd found. "No, sweetheart. Some castles are meant to fall, so better ones can be built." Catherine touched the galaxy she'd painted overhead. "Scarlett always said that sometimes you have to let go of what you thought you wanted to find what you really need." She met Thad's eyes, years of hostility finally dissolving into understanding. Eleanor finished her crane, setting it with the others on the windowsill where they caught the afternoon light. "Your father," she said to Thad, "would have chosen the company. In fact, he did, over and over again. But you—" She smiled at Aurora. "You chose love." "Actually," Aurora said, reaching for her sketchbook, "we all chose love." She showed them her latest drawing, a new kind of castle built not of steel and glass, but of intertwined hearts and hands, with a garden full of purple and orange flowers stretching up to a star-filled sky. Vivian, still at the door, cleared her throat. "The board is calling. They want to offer you back your position, with full control." The old Thad would have reached for that offer like a lifeline, but the man who had learned to draw again, who had held his daughter through nights of pain and days of small victories, who had watched his mother teach Aurora to fold paper cranes while Catherine painted stars overhead, that man had different priorities. "Tell them thank you," he said, picking up a pencil to add to Aurora's drawing, "but I'm already CEO of something far more important." As if in response to his words, Aurora's monitors showed the strongest readings they'd had in months. Dr. Chen was already making notes, talking about accelerated recovery times and medical journals. But Thad wasn't listening. He was watching his daughter teach his mother how to draw impossible flowers, while Catherine added a new constellation to their galaxy above, this one in the shape of a family holding hands. The empire he'd lost had been built on numbers and deals, but this new one, created in a hospital room with art supplies and paper cranes, was built on something far stronger, the kind of love that heals more than just bodies. It heals souls. 1 year later, the fog still rolled through San Francisco's streets, but Thad Sterling saw it differently now, not as an obstacle to visibility, but as nature's way of painting the sky. He stood in what used to be Scarlett's studio, now transformed into a light-filled space where children's artwork covered the walls and the infamous galaxy still sparkled on the ceiling. The Sterling Matthews Art Therapy Foundation, Aurora read from the new plaque by the door, her voice clear and strong. For kids who need to heal their hearts. At 7, she'd grown taller, healthier, her mother's creativity and her father's determination shining in every gesture. The experimental treatment had worked better than anyone had dared to hope, though they still visited Dr. Chen every few months for checkups. "Your mom would have loved this," Catherine said, adjusting a frame containing Scarlett's last painting, a swirl of purple and orange flowers that now served as the foundation's logo. The past year had transformed her, too, from bitter guardian to beloved aunt, her artistic talents now dedicated to helping other children find healing through art. Eleanor entered carrying a string of 1,000 paper cranes she'd made during Aurora's treatment. "The new family support wing is ready," she announced, "and the first group of patients arrives next week." Her relationship with Thad had been rebuilt crane by crane, story by story, as they'd learned together what family really meant. "Mr. Sterling?" Vivian appeared, tablet in hand as always, but now she was more family than employee. "The board of directors for the foundation is ready for your quarterly presentation." She smiled at Aurora. "And your junior director has the floor first." Aurora grabbed her portfolio, a birthday gift from Catherine, filled with drawings of her journey from hospital room to healing. But before she could head to the meeting room, she paused by the window, looking out at the city below. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever miss your old castle?" Thad joined her at the window. In the distance, he could see the Sterling Innovations building piercing the fog, still standing but no longer the center of his world. He'd maintained a small stake in the company, but had channeled most of his resources into the foundation, into creating spaces where art and healing could intertwine. "I built that castle thinking it would make me immortal," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But your mother taught me that real immortality lives in the hearts we touch, the lives we change." He picked up a pencil from a nearby table, he always kept them handy now, and began a quick sketch in Aurora's portfolio. "Some people spend their whole lives building castles in the sky." "When real magic is in the gardens below," Aurora finished, adding her own lines to his drawing. It was their thing now, collaborative art, each piece a conversation in color and form. The meeting room was filling up, board members, medical advisors, art therapists. But Thad lingered for a moment with his daughter, watching her add stars to their sketch. Catherine joined them, then Eleanor, each adding their own touch to the drawing. Even Vivian contributed a carefully drawn flower. "You know what Mom would say?" Aurora looked up at all of them, her mother's smile lighting up her face. "She'd say we finally learned to put the right colors together." Thad looked at his perfectly imperfect family. The sister-in-law who'd become a friend, the mother he'd reconnected with, the assistant who'd become family, and the daughter who'd taught him how to see in color again. Outside, the fog was doing its daily dance with the sun, turning the world into a watercolor of possibilities. "Ready to change some lives?" he asked, offering Aurora his hand. She took it, standing tall and strong, so different from the sick little girl in that hospital room a year ago. "Ready," she said, "but first—" She pulled out her colored pencils, the ones that had once belonged to her mother. "Let's add some purple and orange to the world." As they walked into the boardroom together, Thad realized that some inheritances weren't built of steel and stock options, but of love and second chances. And those, unlike empires, could never crumble. They could only grow, one impossible flower at a time.